book Sandwiched In. I'm Janet Henderson, and I'm going to be introducing our reviewer in just a moment, but I do want to encourage everyone to check out the idea of becoming a friend of the library and joining the Book Sandwiched In committee on choosing books that are being reviewed. Check the library website, tulsalibrary.org/friends. We'd love to have you join us. Today, Eldon Eisenach, a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Tulsa, was raised in Yankton, South Dakota. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and his graduate degrees from Berkeley. After teaching at Penn State and Cornell in 1985, he came to chair the political science department at TU. He retired in 2007, but continues to write books, articles, and many, many book reviews. His most recent book, Sacred Discourse in American Nationality, was published in 2012. He served 9 years on the Friends Board and was a longtime member of the BSI committee. Eldon, I'm going to let you introduce the books that you'll be reviewing, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about these very interesting subjects.
Thank you, Janet. I did the first Zoom book review in some corner of the library basement. I hope I'm now doing the second to the last, and I hope it is the second to the last and that we can begin meeting again in Aronson Auditorium. I'm reviewing two books today. One is The Splendid and the Vile, and the other is Daughters of Yalta. The first book is written by Erik Larson, tracing Churchill's first year in office as Prime Minister of England. The second, Daughters of Yalta, covers the Yalta Conference of the victorious Allies at the end of the war through the eyes of three daughters of participants in the Russian conference: Sarah Churchill, Anna Roosevelt, and Kathleen Harriman, whose father, Averell Harriman, was the US ambassador to Russia. The other author is Catherine Katz. It's her first book, but alas, it might be her last, because she is now wasting her time and talents as a student at Harvard Law School. The first book covers May 10th, 1940 to May 10th, 1941, as Churchill became Prime Minister of England, and almost exactly coincided with the air campaign of bombing by Germany in England. As he puts it, mine is a more intimate account that delves into how Churchill and his circle went about surviving on a daily basis. The dark moments and the light, the romantic entanglements and debacles, the sorrows and the laughter, and the odd little episodes that reveal how life was really lived under Hitler's tempest of steel. This was the year in which Churchill became Churchill, the cigar-smoking bulldog we all think we know, when he made his greatest speeches and showed the world what courage and leadership looked like. On Winston's first day as prime minister, Hitler invaded Holland and Belgium. Poland and Czechoslovakia had already fallen, and the Dunkirk evacuation was just 2 weeks away. For the next 12 months, Hitler would wage a relentless bombing campaign, killing 45,000 Britons. Planners thought that the death toll would be so high that they would run out of regular burial places and caskets. So they called for large pits to be excavated on the outskirts of London and other cities, digging to be done with as much discretion as possible, and holding 5 bodies deep in these pits. Special training was to be provided to morticians to decontaminate the bodies and the clothing of people killed by poison gas. So it was a rather auspicious first day of office and first year of office for Churchill. Just how important America was to Churchill's strategic thinking became evident when his son, Randolph, one morning soon after his appointment, walked into his father's bedroom at the Admiralty House, which is where he had one of his offices. and found him standing before a wash basin and mirror shaving. Randolph was home on leave from the Queen's Own Hussars, Churchill's old regiment, in which Randolph now served as an officer. "Sit down, dear boy, and read the papers while I finish shaving." After a few moments, Churchill made a half turn toward his son. "I think I see my way through." He turned back to the mirror. Randolph understood that his father was talking about the war. The remark startled him, he recalled, for he himself saw little chance that Britain could win. "Do you mean we can avoid defeat?" Randolph asked, "and beat the bastards?" At this, Churchill threw his razor into the basin, whirled to face his son. "Of course we can beat them," he snapped. "Well, I'm all for it," Randolph said, "but I don't see how you can do it." Churchill replied, "I shall drag the United States in." What I want to do is just give you a few vignettes, because this is a micro history with lots of things taken from diaries, letters, journals that Larson had so deeply researched. I began with his son, Randolph, who was chatting with while he was shaving. Randolph was very good looking, loud, lacked tact, drank too much, and spent his income by gambling with an incredible amount of ineptitude. Even as Churchill tried to stabilize his own financial condition, Randolph asked for help paying his debts, which Churchill agreed to do. "It was indeed generous of you to say that you would meet £100 of my bills," Randolph wrote to his father 1 month into his prime ministership. "That portion today would be worth 6,000. I do hope it is not very inconvenient for you to do this. I enclose the two most urgent." More troubling in terms of Randolph's future was his marital failure. To him, fidelity was a fungible condition. Take it or leave it, but mostly take it. He loved sexual conquest, whether his target was married or not, and he took full advantage of the century-old custom whereby country homes arranged guest accommodations to foster liaisons. From the start, Randolph demonstrated that he was anything but an ideal husband. Though he conveyed an image of dash and charm, he also had a tedious side. On their honeymoon with Pamela, I'll get to her later, he read to her at night the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. He read lengthy passages and treated Pamela more like a distracted pupil than a marital bedmate. At intervals, he would ask, "Are you listening?" "Yes," she would answer. "Well, what was the last sentence?" he replied. Now turning to Pamela, his really sexy wife. She was terribly sexy and obvious, a fellow debutante once said. She was very plump and so bosomy, we called her the dairymaid. She wore high heels and tossed her bottom around. We thought she was quite outrageous. She was known as hot stuff, a very sexy young thing. An American visitor, Kathy Harriman, whom we'll meet in the other book, wrote, "She's a wonderful girl, my age, but one of the wisest young girls I've ever met, knows everything political and otherwise." Pamela and Randolph Churchill got married after dating for 2 weeks before he was shipped off, and he thought he would die in the war, but he wanted to father a son and heir before he did. He proposed on the second date, and she, matching impulse for impulse, accepted. He was nearly a decade older and stunningly handsome, but the thing that appealed most to her was he was a Churchill at the center of power. Another person who weaves in and out of the book's vignettes is his daughter, Mary. She was 18. Mary, while Hitler was inflicting death and trauma on untold millions of the Low Countries, Mary, age 18, went out with friends, having the time of her life. One evening was a dinner party for her close friend, a cousin, daughter of the former Secretary of State of India and his wife, Venetia. They went out to dinner, and after dinner, Mary, Mark, and their friends went to the famed Savoy Hotel to dance, then moved on to a nightclub favored by London's well-off young men and women, the 400, known as the nighttime headquarters of society. It was in a cellar in Leicester Square. The club stayed open till dawn as guests waltzed and foxtrotted to the music of an 18-piece orchestra. This was during the bombing. She said, danced almost exclusively with Mark, very nice, home in bed, 4 a.m. In a way, you'd think she was awfully superficial, but in a way, England was asked to carry on their regular lives and take account of the bombing. Most people didn't go to bomb shelters, they stayed in their own houses, usually down in the basement. So the phrase was, carry on London. Another prominent person in this book is Averell Harriman, whom Churchill knew quite well and was cultivating to get America to enter into the war or to loan them money and military supplies. You already heard of the feckless son of Winston. Here's a bit about, Pamela Churchill and Averell Harriman. Pamela eventually, when she was in her late 50s, ended up marrying Averell Harriman after she was long divorced from Randolph. But you've heard of the feckless son of Winston. Here's a bit about Pamela. Randolph was gambling more and more as he was on a voyage to Egypt to be stationed there. And he lost the equivalent of $190,000 gambling on the boat. Half of it owed to just one man, a member of one of the richest families of England, soon to inherit a vast mansion in Yorkshire that became the setting for Pride and Prejudice. So Pamela was a good friend of Lord Beaverbrook, whom Churchill brought in to be the czar of aircraft production for defense against German bombers. Beaverbrook was very, very rich. He was a newspaper mogul from Canada. She asked for money to send to her husband Randolph, who was steeped in debt. Beaverbrook surprised her. He said, I'm not going to give you anything for him, but I'll give you £3,000, about $90,000 now, and I'll do it for you. And at the same time, he said, because she didn't have any money and her husband was deeply in debt, she could move her son and nanny into his country home, and he would make sure they were looked after. And then she would be free to move into London. She leased her house in the country to a nursery school, and that gave her some money over the rent that she was being paid. And in London, she took a room on the top floor of the Dorchester, sharing it with Churchill's niece, Clarissa. Not as glamorous or as expensive as it might sound, she wrote, since it was not a popular floor during the constant air raids. It was way close to the roof. But she still had no money. Now, the Dorchester supplied free breakfast. And I think Beaverbrook was paying for that as well. And then she could lunch at the supply ministry where she worked. But then the rest of the day, she had to cage dinner invitations from all of her social contacts. And then she began she was always, I'd say, deeply, deeply in debt. She began to sell her wedding presents, including, she said later, some diamond earrings and a couple of nice bracelets. In the midst of it all, she lost her new pregnancy. She had already given birth to the needed son. And she knew at this point, after the miscarriage of her second child, that her marriage was over. And that gave her a new sense of freedom. helped by the fact that she would celebrate her 21st birthday. In fact, with Averell Harriman and his daughter. Averell was now ambassador to London, then became later ambassador to Germany. So this was the beginning of her long courtship with Averell Harriman, who was much, much older. He died in 1971. At any rate, when they got married, finally, it was a very long romance, and she had had a husband or two in between. He was 79 and she was 51. Now, a bit about Churchill from the book as well. Pending Chamberlain, who was the prime minister, pending his departure from 10 Downing, Churchill established an office on the ground floor of Admiralty House, which was the headquarters of the Navy, where he planned to work at night. He had strange habits. I think many of you already know of his weird habits, but he had a typist and a private secretary in the dining room and daily traversed a walkway populated with furniture and a dolphin motif. His office was an inner room. On his desk, he kept a miscellany of pills, powders, and toothpicks, as well as cuffs to protect his sleeves, various gold medals, which he deployed as paperweights. Bottles of whiskey stood on an adjacent table. So at night, he was at Admiralty House. In the day, he began to occupy his office at Downing. But Churchill's notion of what constituted an office was expansive. Generals, ministers, and staff members would find themselves meeting with Churchill while he was in his bathtub, one of his favorite places to work. He also liked working in bed and spent hours there each morning going through dispatches and reports with a typist seated nearby. Always present was the box, the black dispatch box that contains reports, correspondence, and minutes from other officials requiring his attention. And then he had his various private secretaries. Within 2 days of taking office, he ordered 37 Royal Air Force bombers to attack a German city, München-Gladbach, in a heavily industrialized rural district, Ruhr, the iron area, the steel valley of Germany. The raid killed but 4 people. One of them, oddly enough, was an Englishman. But mere mayhem wasn't the point. This mission and other raids soon to follow were meant to signal to the British public, to Hitler, and especially to the United States, that Britain intended to fight. The same message that Churchill sought to convey on Monday, May 13th, 10 days after taking office, when he gave his first speech before the House of Commons. This was the speech with the famous lines, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." Now, he took office May 10th. On May 15th, France surrendered. A 900,000 army dissolved. There was no help to England. The Low Countries were taken, Czechoslovakia, Poland were taken. So he was essentially alone. And through sheer grit and incredible Herculean efforts of Beaverbrook, they got aircraft production to double and then triple, little side help from the United States. And that kept morale going because they shot down lots of German planes. And they were very clever in interfering with the signals that the pilots would get. The German pilots would get radio signals as they were trying to bomb various cities in England, and they often missed. Many other parts of the book were set in Chequers, which was a country home of the prime ministers. It was easily visible, and on weekends of full moons, they would go to another place because they thought under a full moon they could be bombed by German planes. But the Chequers, he continued his is governing through with checkers as private secretaries, as assistants, and various people would travel up and down. They also had big dinners and Thanksgiving. They celebrated regular holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas. One Christmas, they were given a 45-pound turkey from a guy, a lord, who had left it in his will. He died just before Christmas, that this turkey was to go to Churchill for his checkers dinner, and another lord would send apples from his orchard to Churchill. So it was both a world historical series of events and a glimpse of the everyday life of the English ruling classes. So it was fun at almost all these levels. I want to turn now to Yalta. Larson's book, as I said, covered a year, May 10th to May 10th. Katz's book covers 10 days, a little less than 10 days, actually, because the Yalta conference was just 7 days, six and a half days. It ran from February 4th to February 11th, 1945. So now the war was over, but it was before we bombed Japan, before the atomic bomb. Roosevelt had died. Truman took office. Then we bombed Japan and forced their surrender. So the main purpose of Roosevelt was to get Stalin to declare war against Japan. So he was quite willing to make a series of compromises at Yalta because the war was still raging in Asia. The Germans had surrendered. So the purpose of the conference, the actual purpose, is not to get Roosevelt to get Stalin to declare war on Japan. The purpose of the conference was to geographically distribute the military occupation of Germany. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. And this distribution of Germany, the Allied French, American, British, and then the Soviet one, as we all know, with the Wall of Berlin and the Iron Curtain later. But they were to divide Germany, to take care of prisoners of war, and to figure out future initiatives, the favorite of Roosevelt's being the foundation of the United Nations. And oddly enough, Stalin was quite in favor of it too. Churchill's purpose was much more to defend the Soviet-occupied areas of Eastern Europe, because the Polish government in exile was headquartered in London. So Churchill was very, very interested in making sure that the occupied areas, particularly Poland, occupied by the Red Army, would be able to establish its own free and democratic government. But at any rate, the distribution of spoils, shall we say, spoils of victory, was clearly not based on the relative contributions to the victory over Germany, but on the present and projected relative power of the victors. If it were based on mere sacrifices to defeat Germany, we would have given the Soviet Union almost everything. After all, they lost between 9 and 10 million military soldiers. The United Kingdom lost 383,600, the United States 416,800. If it were based on how much you contributed to the war, how much sacrifice in blood and flesh, Yugoslavia should have been invited. They lost more men than either the United States or Britain, both military and civilian. The civilian deaths in the Soviet Union were 25 times that of Britain's and United States combined. So it wasn't based on how much sacrifice you made to defeat the Nazis. It was based on your present power position. And there the United States was in the catbird seat. After all, we had supplied a huge amount of armaments that made the Russian victories in the Eastern Front possible. By the way, Germany lost 3.6 million soldiers on the Eastern Front, 516,000 soldiers on the Western Front. In other words, about 4 times as many were lost fighting on the Eastern Front as on the Western. So Larson's book had one principal over 1 year. That was Churchill. All the focus was on him and those he was related to. Katz's book has 7. The 4 principals, FDR, Churchill, Stalin, and now ambassador to Russia, Averell Harriman, then ambassador to the Soviet Union, and the 3 daughters, which gives us the title of the book. Anna Roosevelt, or it's her maiden name. Bettinger was her married name. So Anna Roosevelt, Kathleen or Kathy Harriman, I like her a lot, so I call her Kathy, and Sarah Churchill. Now, the setting for the story is really incredible. Stalin insisted it be held in the Soviet Union. Yalta was a resort in Crimea that had been the summer palaces of the czars of Russia and the nobility of Russia. And then it became a sort of workers' paradise resort under the communists after the czars had been defeated. The Soviets had 3 weeks to take 3 really ramshackle villas into sites for the 3 delegations and the site of the Yalta Conference itself. 3 weeks to make a conference site where everything had been pillaged. The Nazis had taken everything, door handles. They'd even taken door handles. There was nothing. So who was put in charge but Beria, the head of the NKVD, the evil man of the Soviet Union, if anyone was the most evil. And the largest palace was to house the American delegation and be the conference site. It had 116 rooms that had been the summer home of Nicholas and Alexandra. It was here that Kathy Harriman was put in charge to take this ruined palace and turn it into a livable space for hundreds of delegates in the American delegation, the principals and the others, and the conference site itself. Kathleen Harriman, a glamorous 27-year-old daughter of the 4th richest man in America, now stood 3 days before the conference. She had 3 days, but 3. Thousands of workers crowded the palace. Beria emptied a prisoner of war camp of Romanians and turned them under gunpoint to clean up the palaces. There were thousands of Romanian POWs running around and all sorts of commandeered workers from Moscow. They crowded the palace and gardens, sewing, hammering, painting, fumigating, a lot of fumigating, polishing and planting, not to mention plumbing. Cots had been set up for the conscripted laborers and the Romanian prisoners of war, and the Soviets had brought in to clear the area of the wreckage the war left behind. But still, there were hardly enough places to sleep for everyone toiling away on these grounds. Well, what was at stake? The notion that they could in 5 or 6 days settle matters as complicated as German partition, reparation payments, the structure of Roosevelt's International Peace Organization, that's the UN, Soviet participation in the Pacific War, and free elections in Eastern Europe was pure folly. Of all the issues for debate, nothing upset Churchill more than the Americans' complacency about the future of Poland. The Americans fumed Churchill to his daughter are profoundly ignorant of the Polish problem. At Malta, it was an earlier meeting of the Allies. I mentioned to them the independence of Poland and was met with a retort, but surely that is not at stake. And if the Western Allies failed to secure Polish independence, Churchill, if they were to fail to secure it, Churchill was the one who would have to look the exiled Polish leaders in London and tell them they no longer had a country, while the Americans scuttled back to Washington. Worst of all, Churchill realized that because of Britain's weakened position on the world stage, he was powerless to compel the Soviet to do what was right without Roosevelt's full support. But back to Livadia Palace, 116 rooms. Kathy Harriman in charge to get it ready for the delegation. Curiously, Livadia Palace, 116 rooms, was smaller than the mansion Kathy Harriman grew up in upstate, in New York, near New York. But she was placed in charge. She spoke Russian. She was a news reporter in Moscow, spoke Russian, and had experience supervising large enterprises. Her father or grandfather, I forget which, founded Sun Valley, Idaho, and she was often placed in charge to run it. The Soviets also conveniently ransacked Moscow's luxury hotels and shipped their loot in more than 1,500 railway cars. 1,500 railway cars full of luxury loot from hotels in Moscow to stock the three villas. In the meantime, she prepared a pamphlet guidebook for the American delegation, which was arriving in 72 hours. Kathy was 27 years old. Another prominent daughter was Sarah Churchill. Now, Sarah never made it into Larson's book, even though she was a daughter of Churchill. She married early. She was an actress, married to a twice previously married American actor, many years her senior. They were divorced by this time in all but name. And Sarah became absolutely essential to Winston, looking after his health and accompanying him to international conferences. She was at Tehran, the three-power conference 2 years earlier. So, and this time, FDR, Harriman, and Churchill met in Malta before proceeding on to Yalta to coordinate their strategy. And it is here that Sarah met the third daughter, Anna Roosevelt, who was 38 years old, 3 children from her first marriage and 1 child from her current husband. Marriage was a problem for all of the people, it seemed, in both Larson's and this book. Together, the 3 daughters were tasked with incredible challenges. These delegations were, the official delegates were numbered in 12, 15, 20, the Americas was the largest. But again, hundreds of others. The official American delegation, curiously, included Alger Hiss, who would later be convicted as a Soviet spy. He held a very crucial position as sort of secretary of the proceedings under the State Department. The complete contingent of Americans and British exceeded 200. Each member of the American and British delegation was looked after by just these 3 women: sleeping quarters, orientation, food, sanitation, health, under these very, very challenging positions. Some examples. I won't go on to the health problem, but Churchill had incredible bouts of high blood pressure, and as did FDR. Churchill, just before going to Yalta to meet with Roosevelt before they went to Yalta, had a fever of 102, and he had a personal physician with him, as did FDR, but he recovered by the start of the official meetings. FDR had very, very precarious health, and of course he had his personal physician, but it was his daughter who mostly looked after and coordinated his health. Toilets and lodging. Now you got 100 people, several hundred people in the Livadia Palace. They shared 9 toilets and 4 bathtubs. 35 military officers shared 9 buckets beside their beds for washing up and shaving. 6 colonels shared 1 room. Junior officers were stuffed in the eaves. Kathy Harriman arranged all of this, and always under the eye of NKVD officers who followed her everywhere. They shadowed her. Now I want to end with a slight aftermath. Kathleen Harriman and Pamela Churchill, the foxy one, the first wife of Randolph, were best friends. They shared rooms in London when Averill was ambassador there during the war. And after Yalta, they met in New York City, where Kathleen became a correspondent for Newsweek. Pamela introduced Kathleen to one of her dates, whom Kathleen eventually married. So when Kathleen offered Pamela, again, always short of money, always desperate, Kathleen offered Pamela her annual Newsweek salary, which meant nothing to Kathleen because she was a Harriman. She quickly accepted this generous offer, considering it a sort of finder's fee for this future husband of Kathleen. Well, now, just briefly after Yalta. On August 6, 1945, Truman was president, Roosevelt dead. The Americans dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 2 days later, after the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The next day, the Americans dropped a second atomic bomb, and within a week, the Japanese surrendered unconditionally. So as the final common enemy was vanquished, any pretense of continuing partnership between America, England, and the Soviet Union quickly evaporated. In March of 1946, again, we bombed Japan and they surrendered in August of 1945. In March of 1946, a year after the Yalta Conference, President Truman asked Winston Churchill to address a crowd in a little college in the little town of Fulton, Missouri, in Truman's home state. There, Churchill offered one of his most enduring statements, and I'll conclude the review with this. As he said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. 15 years later, with the world locked in the Cold War, that curtain, of course, became the physical wall dividing East and West Berlin. These are fine books. They're sort of historical fictions in the sense that the authors put all this together into a narrative, but it's based on an incredible amount of research. Both Katz and Larson must have had teams of researchers to do all this, to round up all the diaries and statements and journals and memoirs that go into it. So it's not a sort of official history from government documents and government actions, but it's a highly personalized series of vignettes where you get a peek at the actual people in their actual lives that were helping, but at the same time helping to shape world historical events. So I'll end here and take any questions.
Okay, Eldon, I'm going to check and see, and I'll be reading them. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. And let me give people a minute or two to think about that. And let me, after Thanksgiving, we have sort of the highlight of the library year. The Peggy V. Helmrich Distinguished Author Award is presented at the beginning of December. And this year, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Marilynne Robinson will be accepting that award. However, on this coming Monday, November the 29th, Rebecca Howard, who is a member of the selection committee, will offer a retrospective of Robinson's work, highlighting its significance and impact on the literary world. Her books include the beloved novel Gilead and her most recent work, Jack, the fourth book in the Gilead Quartet. In the meantime, let's see if we've got some comments here.
Let me also say that if you read anything by Mary Lynn Robinson, read Gilead. I picked it up by accident, read it, and it was just an incredible book. Set in Iowa, small town. I was from South Dakota. It's about a congregational minister. My dad was a congregational minister. So I really liked that book. And so I also read all the others she wrote. But it's a wonderful read.
Excellent. Well, we do have one comment. Dr. Eisenach renders all so intriguing. Definitely would like to read both of them after this detailed and revealing review. What a treasure has with the guidance and leadership, Eldon Eisenach.
Oh,
Well,
well,
a pat on the back and
more, yeah.
thank you, Ms. Thompson, for putting our appreciation in such eloquent words. There's also a comment. I remember an anecdote or two about Churchill cavorting around in pajamas or something unusual. Do you think he was manic? How to reconcile his wild behavior with his genius and leadership?
I think he was a manic, but he was an incredible manic for an incredible time. I mean, if you needed a manic at any time in British history, you needed one there. I mean, he would go down into the subways wearing pajamas and robe and carrying a glass of brandy, for God's sake, and say, "How are you doing?" You know? So there was incredible aplomb. I mean, I don't always like the British. They're snobbish and insular, etc. But during the war, they had incredible morale. There was Larson mentions this in the book. They were always doing mass surveys of people and what they were doing, and they had a huge sample, I think 3,000 or 4,000, maybe more, cross sample of England, that they would take, I think, monthly surveys. And from those, they would gauge the morale of the British people and their behaviors. And that's why one thing was that 70% of the people stayed in their own houses during the bombings, having tea in the basement or in some back room. So that was that was an incredible tribute to a half-crazed manic man like Churchill, who carried on his normal life in full view of everyone in England. They would follow him, his comings and goings, and listen to his talks, and then witness his weird appearances in subway shelters. So that was a nice addition to though Larson's book did not mention Churchill going into the subways and in England they called it the London Underground, to buck up the spirits of the people. But people could feel his optimism and his level of care and activity simply by following him around or getting word of what he was up to day and night, often mostly at night, in bed and out.
Eldon, thank you for those comments and thank you for giving us this excellent review. And for all of the participants, we'll see you next Monday at noon, 12:10 with Rebecca's review of Marilyn Robinson's works. Thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon.